On the issue of accountability, there's really not much to debate. Paul George just mentioned that there is a standard for the use of force in international affairs. First of all, it's in the UN Charter. Any use of force in international affairs, or for example, any threat of force, such as the current threat against Iran, is a criminal offense. It's in violation of the fundamental principles of international law codified in the UN Charter. Alongside of that stands the Nuremberg Tribunal, which, as Paul just mentioned, defined aggressive war, as the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. Well, the Iraq War is kind of a textbook example of aggression, which is also defined in the Nuremberg Tribunal. It's a perfect example. And that means that those responsible for the aggression have committed the ultimate crime, and that includes everything that followed, including the killing of hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million people, millions of refugees, the country virtually destroyed, so much so that Iraqis refer to it as comparable to the Mongol invasions, the sectarian warfare which was inspired by it, and everything else. It includes all the evil that follows. Well, there was discussion at Nuremberg about preemptive war. The Nazi foreign minister was tried, charged, and convicted and hanged for various crimes, of which one of the most serious was preemptive war. He supported the Nazi invasion of Norway at a time when Germany knew that the British were intending to invade Germany from Norway. So it was a clear case of preemptive war, but not considered a legitimate defense. He was hanged. In Tokyo tribunals, there was an argument by the Japanese war criminals that they were involved in preemptive war. I remember how the war that we were involved in started 10 years after Japanese aggression. They bombed 2 military bases in U.S. territories, which had been taken from their violence and hell half a century ago. They bombed those military bases because they knew, in fact they could read in the American press, that they were being prepared for a major assault against Japan, which would, as they could read, would incinerate the ant heaps in Japan in which those creatures crawled around. They knew that B-17s, flying fortresses, were rolling off the Boeing assembly lines and being sent there prepared to incinerate the ant heaps, and that they were even being sent from the European theater. And at that point, they attacked the 2 military bases from which the attack was to be launched. That's what we call the date which will live in infamy. They tried to offer that defense, but it was not considered acceptable. They were hanged. Those are pretty clear cases of preemptive war. Now, the Iraq War does not rise to that level. There's no serious sense in which it's a preemptive war, so essentially this defense is irrelevant. The Japanese and the Nazis, of course, professed the most noble ideals. In fact, it's hard to find a case of aggression and atrocities in history which are not defended that way. That was not considered a defense, and it shouldn't have been. Well, that's the standard. It's not that the Nuremberg standard is so noble. In fact, it was deeply flawed morally in ways we ought to be concerned about. The Nuremberg trials were based on the moral principle that a war crime is a crime that you committed and we didn't. So, for example, heavy bombing of urban concentrations was not considered a war crime because the Allies did more of it than the Germans. German war criminals were able to defend themselves successfully if they could show that their American or British counterparts had committed the same crimes. So it's by no means a noble standard, but it's nevertheless a serious standard. At a minimum, a standard we should stand up for. The person who presided over the Nuremberg tribunals, U.S. Justice Robert Jackson, addressed the tribunal in an important address, and he said that we are handing these defendants a poisoned chalice, and if we ever sip from it, if we ever do something similar, we must be subject to the same judgments. Otherwise, this trial is a complete farce. Well, that poses the question of accountability. Do we say that the trial was a complete farce, or do we accept even that limited standard? There's no question of the applicability of the charges. It seems to me that essentially finishes the question of accountability on the core issue. The question remains, we have to make a decision.